Trauma and the Brain for Service Providers, Managing the Stress of Caring for Others. Presented by Erin M. Carter, LMHC, with Mosaic Family Counseling Center, Incorporated, in collaboration with the Iowa Department of Human Rights. The purpose of this presentation is to give service providers the information they need to better understand how trauma impacts the body and the brain. This presentation will offer an understanding of trauma and stress, will detail the brain-body alarm system, and will cover information on the adaptive information processing model. This presentation will also explain the diagnostic criteria for acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, explain risk and resilience factors, and detail the role of three brain structures, the basal ganglia, the limbic system, and the anterior cingulate gyrus, and finally offer recommendations for improving the functioning of these structures in order to reduce stress and trauma-related symptoms. So we'll begin by talking about what trauma is, how it relates to stress, and by explaining what we mean when we say vicarious trauma. First of all, let's look at the definition of trauma given by the DSM-5. Now, the DSM-5 stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's the 5th edition, and it's the source for diagnostic criteria and other information about mental disorders that is used by psychologists, psychiatrists, psychotherapists, social workers, and all other mental health professionals in the United States and often internationally. The DSM-5 is produced by the American Psychiatric Association. So the DSM-5 defines trauma as exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways: directly experiencing the traumatic event, witnessing the trauma in person as it occurs to others, learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend, the event must have been violent or accidental, as opposed to a long illness. And experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to the aversive details of the traumatic event, such as first responders who collect human remains, police officers and other rescue personnel exposed to the details of child abuse. The DSM-5's definition is helpful, but trauma experts think more broadly about trauma as well. Therapists who specialize in trauma often conceptualize trauma as being divided into the big T trauma events and little t trauma events. Now, the big T traumas are the things we all think of when we think about trauma. Big T trauma events include war, a car crash, natural disaster, or physical or sexual assault, that kind of thing. When we think about little t traumas, we're thinking about bad moments that violate our sense of safety in some way, but that might not be recognizable to those outside of us as traumatic. Violating our sense of safety, that could mean disrupting our connections with people important to us, or to cause us to feel worthless or unimportant, or make us realize that the world isn't a safe and stable place. It can be helpful to think about trauma as a spectrum that begins with the least negative impact, with stress. Stress can be a good thing in the right amount. Exercise that makes us more fit is a good level of physical stress. Learning something new that feels hard at first is stress for our brains, and studies show that continuing to learn new things throughout our lives causes us to have healthier minds that work better as we age. A good amount of stress can feel a little scary, but also exciting. It can give us a little burst of adrenaline that makes us more focused and maybe causes us to do things we normally wouldn't do. But when stress goes on for too long, when it's too intense, or when a person finds themselves unable to lessen it or to take a break from it, then it starts to be damaging. Stress like this ultimately has the same effect on us as those little t traumas. And over time, little t traumas can have the impact of the big T traumas. That's helpful background to help us understand what we call vicarious trauma, which is sometimes also called secondary trauma or caregiver trauma or compassion stress injury. Vicarious trauma is when we don't experience the traumatic event ourselves, But because of a relationship with a traumatized person, we can begin to experience the same physical, cognitive, and emotional effects we would have if we had experienced the trauma firsthand. Family members, intimate partners, and close friends of someone who's experienced trauma can suffer from vicarious trauma, but so can service providers whose jobs cause them to be exposed frequently or in intense ways to the details of someone else's trauma. I once worked as a therapist with a young woman who was a victim of sex trafficking. She was severely traumatized, and I spent a lot of time listening her try to sort out the details of the torture she'd experienced. One day, after I'd been meeting with her for several months, someone surprised me by lightly slamming a door, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. When I thought about it, I realized that I had been feeling a lot edgier, more irritable than normal, and had been more anxious about my physical safety when I was out in public. The level of symptoms I was feeling was still more on the stress end of the spectrum, and it never went past that, partly because I was able to recognize it and take steps to manage my stress. To put this into perspective, let's consider why caregiving is so stressful. It's stressful, first of all, because we want to help, and sometimes we can't. We see our clients struggle with financial problems, health and mental health problems, relationships problems. We see them struggle with really difficult circumstances, with injustice, and with abuse. Some of those problems we can address, but some of them are problems that we can't solve, and that can take a toll on us emotionally. Caregiving is also stressful because the problems of others can trigger our own personal stress or worries, or even our own trauma history. Talking about the worries of others can sometimes make it very difficult to forget about our own. It's also stressful because in our jobs we want to and need to be seen as professionally competent, which sometimes means hiding how affected we are by our own difficulties or the difficulties of our clients. So that's another level of pressure. And finally, caregiving can be stressful because of a special kind of cell in our brains called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are structures in our brains that allow us to really get on the same page with others. They're really important for bonding, for being able to experience and express empathy, and they help us to understand the motivations and intentions of others. From a physical survival standpoint, it's important to be able to understand the motivations and intentions of others, so that tells us that mirror neurons have a big impact on us. It's good and helpful in our jobs. It helps us to empathize and provide what people need, but there's a drawback. Mirror neurons cause us to actually experience some of the distress that others are feeling. When our clients express fear, our brains register that fear. When our clients feel grief and frustration, our brains register those emotions as our own. Over time, all of these factors can put us under chronic and overwhelming stress and even trauma. So let's talk about what happens in our brain and body when we're going through something really frightening. It can be helpful to think for a moment about why we experience fear. What good does that do for us? Fear is a very important emotion that helps us to survive danger, especially if that danger is the kind of physical threat that most humans throughout most of human history have been facing. We're designed to survive danger. When we see a possible threat, think a bear in the woods, a tiny structure in our brains called the hypothalamus, it's the little green part that you see there, the hypothalamus decides that it's dangerous. The hypothalamus sends a fast message to our adrenal glands. Those are a set of glands that are close to our kidneys. The adrenal glands release adrenaline, and adrenaline makes us instantly ready for action. When this happens, the response that we know of as the fight or flight response is activated. If the threat is too overwhelming, the response gets sent to an older part of the brain, a part of the vagus nerve called the dorsal vagus nerve, which originates in the brainstem. The dorsal vagus nerve takes us into immobilization, or the freeze response. Let's think about what happens during the fight or flight response. During this response, a lot of things happen to our body and brain, And we can best understand these things if we consider that the body's resources are being redirected towards surviving a physical threat. When the fight or flight response is activated, heart rate and breathing are increased. Oxygenated blood is sent away from the digestive system and toward large muscle areas. During the fight or flight response, the brain prioritizes threat signals and ignores signs of safety. During this response, the brain prioritizes action over analysis. When there's a physical threat, that is not the time to think deeply or think analytically. It's the time to act. Right? Now, prioritizing threat and action changes the way memories are stored during frightening experiences. If this response is very intense or happens repeatedly, it can actually change the way the brain functions, even when the threat is gone. To better understand these responses, let's think about what happens during a panic attack and reimagine it as the fight or flight response just taken out of context. In other words, a panic attack is similar to what would happen if you saw the bear in the woods, except that there is no bear. During a panic attack, we see an increase in heart rate. We see an increase in respiration, sometimes chest pain, sometimes a sensation of choking or lightheadedness. Seen in terms of the fight or flight response, this is the body's effort to get more oxygenated blood for running away or fighting off the bear. During a panic attack, we might have nausea or abdominal distress. This is the body focusing on processes that help us survive and deprioritizing processes that can wait for later, like digesting our food. During a panic attack, we might have trembling, shaking, or sweating. In terms of fight or flight, adrenaline is released, which energizes our muscles for action. But if we're not actually doing something physical, that's going to look and feel like being very jittery. During a panic attack, people often feel intense fear. Seen in terms of fight or flight, this is the brain making sure our attention is focused on threats. During a panic attack, some people experience what is called derealization or depersonalization. This is a sense of unreality. Things feel dreamlike. Sometimes people feel disconnected from their body. Seen in terms of fight or flight, this is the brain prioritizing action over analysis. Now, many of us are used to hearing about fight or flight, but the idea that fear makes us freeze is something that we often don't take into account. The freeze response is especially important to understand when working with people who have been through traumatic experiences, for instance, for law enforcement or different aspects of the legal system. The freeze response helps us to understand questions like, why didn't they fight back? Why didn't they try to get away? Or why can't they seem to remember what happened or when it happened or to describe it? When the fight or flight response gets overwhelmed, an older part of the brain takes over. This is, as we discussed before, the dorsal vagus nerve, which originates in the brainstem. The dorsal vagus nerve is usually responsible for the functions of our body when we're not under stress, when there's no need for fight or flight. We can think of these functions as the rest and digest response. It's what's going on in our body and brain when we feel okay, when we're not confronting a threat. But the dorsal vagus nerve also acts as a fail-safe when the fight or flight response gets overwhelmed, when the threat is too big for the fight or flight response to take care of. When the dorsal vagus nerve is activated in this way and we're under the power of the freeze response, we are unable to act. We might be unable to think clearly or to speak. This can turn into dissociation, which can feel and seem a little like an out-of-body experience. Some people describe their dissociation experiences as times when they go blank. Other people who dissociate in this way have episodes of amnesia, where they can't remember what just happened or what was said to them or even what they said themselves. Another way of seeing dissociation is that it's a way for the mind to escape when the body can't escape. Now we're going to talk about the AIP, or Adaptive Information Processing model of understanding the effects of trauma. Take a minute first and think about what you expect adaptive information processing to mean in relation to the brain. Then consider this idea. From a psychological perspective, people with PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder have a biased information processing style that, due to the trauma they experienced, causes their attention to be biased toward potentially threatening cues. Okay, so the adaptive information processing model comes from the information processing theory of understanding how the brain works. Now, this is really about learning. Often when we say learning, we think only about academic learning, but some of the most important learning we do, and what we learn the most profoundly, is about safety. When we're very little, before we're really learning about how to walk and use our hands and say words, we're learning about whether we're safe and whether we can trust other people and what to expect from others. This learning continues throughout our lives. Information processing theory compares the learning functions of our brain to a computer system. This is kind of interesting if you think about it, that we're using something humans created as a model for understanding what we're born with. In the language of information processing theory, memories are coded. Memories are stored, but they can be retrieved and updated and saved again. To better understand this, let's think about my toddler niece and my cat. My niece had an experience with my cat where she learned that the cat was pretty, was soft to touch, was delightfully alive and moved and made cute little noises and was all around a pleasant thing to interact with. So my niece coded these memories and stored them. When she saw the cat again later, my niece retrieved these memories, and so she was persuaded to interact with the cat again, have this pleasant experience again. But this time, the cat was not really in the mood for the clumsy petting of a toddler, and she gave my niece a little nip. Now, my niece updated her memories with the new information that sometimes cats are grumpy and do surprising and unpleasant things, and you need to be careful around them. This updated memory was saved, and in the future she'll retrieve her memory about cats in this updated version. Information processing theory says that all of our learning happens this way, the learning that we do about people and about objects and about our place in the world. Now, what is adaptive information processing? This assumes that as we process information, as we code, retrieve, update, and save memories, we're automatically doing it in a way that helps us to survive and thrive, and that we're doing it in a way that benefits us psychologically. The word adaptive means that we do it in a way that helps us to be well. Its opposite would be maladaptive. And in psychology, we sometimes talk about maladaptive behaviors, which are behaviors that hurt us and make functioning more difficult. So adaptive information processing is a model that assumes that humans have a biological and psychological drive toward survival and wellness. So then, if our drive is toward survival and wellness, we must tend toward healing. We can see this at work with physical injuries. When we're physically injured, our bodies often heal on their own. For example, we cut our finger. Most likely, if it's not too deep or doesn't get infected, it heals on its own. Sometimes the injury is more serious. It needs some help. A deeper cut might need stitches. But once it has that help, the healing still takes place as part of the body's natural function. For yet more serious injuries, healing still takes place, but without intervention, the healing might occur in a way that causes problems. A broken bone that's reset can heal and afterward be like it never happened. But if the bone isn't reset, it might heal with a deformity and might cause pain or dysfunction throughout this person's life. Psychological injuries work much the same way. When possible, our minds heal on their own because we process information in a way that's adaptive. Information is taken in. What's adaptive is kept, and what's not helpful is disregarded. That doesn't always mean that what we learn is what from the outside we would consider good or positive lessons. A child who grows up in a home where she's punished severely for making mistakes might learn that she can't make mistakes, that she has to be perfect, or that she should lie. We learn what we need to in order to be able to survive in the environment that we're in, the existing environment, not necessarily what we need to survive in an ideal environment. Let's think about what happens when memories are made in such a way that they don't have access to the rest of the adaptive information that we have stored in our brains. First, consider what memories are. Memories are a network of neurons stored in various regions in the brain. Memories involve sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. They involve emotions and sensations. Some memories are connected with language, and some are not, which is why we have memories that we don't really know how to explain, or even that we don't experience as something we remember, but as something that we know. For example, we all know how to turn on a light switch. We know this because at some point we learned, and we remember that learning. If we didn't remember it, we wouldn't know how to do it. But probably most of us can't talk about how we learned how to turn on a light switch. In a sense, we don't even remember learning it, but it is a memory. When people diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease enter the later stages of the disease, after they've forgotten where and when they are, after they've forgotten that their children are adults and what their names are, after they've forgotten the words that go with objects, they can start to forget things like how to turn on a light switch, because that sort of thing is a memory, even if it's not connected to language. Our memories have emotional understandings connected with them. And when we can put these emotional understandings into words, that becomes what we can think of as our core beliefs. Core beliefs can be verbalized in ways such as, I'm basically safe, or I'm basically not safe. You can generally trust others, or you can generally not trust others. We sometimes don't exactly remember, linguistically and explicitly remember the events that caused us to develop these core beliefs, the same way we might not remember acquiring the knowledge about how to turn on a light switch, but those events are still stored as memories. And remember, those memories can be updated with new information. I might have learned from my childhood that I'm basically safe, but have an intense experience in adulthood that causes me to update my memories with information that danger can happen suddenly and devastatingly. So we've talked about memories. Let's think about how adaptive memory networks get developed. An experience occurs, and without our having to try, certain adaptive perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors form. Because we tend toward psychological health, we sort of stumble into ways of seeing this experience that are helpful. We stumble into helpful thoughts, and we stumble into handling it in ways that work. Now, the next similar experience reactivates previous learned understanding, and new experiences are linked and consolidated into that network. A Canadian neuropsychologist who worked with learning, Donald Hebb, said about 70 years ago that neurons that fire together wire together. So the more we have experiences that are similar or can be connected, the stronger those associations are. The more we stumble into adaptive ways of perceiving and behaving in those experiences, the stronger our adaptive tendencies become. As we've talked about with adaptive information processing, then, what is helpful is kept and what is not helpful or no longer needed is discarded, and our memory networks prepare for the next occurrence. So these repeated occurrences develop into an adaptive memory network. But some memories develop in a way that's not adaptive. Think back to that broken bone that needs resetting. Now, when I say they're developed in a way that's not adaptive, I want to refine that a bit. These memories are likely adaptive in the moment, They help survive a threatening moment or a series of threatening moments or a threatening environment. But ultimately, long term, they're not adaptive. A memory that teaches I'm not safe is helpful in an unsafe moment. But when the circumstances change, when there is safety, and this individual is still living out the belief I'm not safe, it becomes maladaptive. We can think of these memories as frozen because they're isolated from the rest of the adaptive memory network. They don't have access to other helpful information that would help us to incorporate this moment of I'm not safe into a larger picture where there is safety and where context matters. Why do these memories get frozen? Well, disturbing events are coded with higher emotions and stronger connections to physical sensations. Emotionally charged memories develop into emotionally charged neural networks. These emotionally charged neural networks are unable to connect with the adaptive networks. And so these frozen memories are experienced as damaging core beliefs. I'm weak. I'm not safe. I don't deserve good things. Now, core beliefs influence perceptions, emotions, and behaviors. So in some ways, they can be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have a core belief that I'm not safe, that influences the way you see the world. You become more attuned to threats or possible bad outcomes. It also influences behavior, making it more likely that you actually won't be safe. One way we see the freeze response, that response activated by the dorsal vagus nerve, affects people in maladaptive ways is that once they've had a powerful experience of being unsafe to the point that their brain activated the failsafe and they froze, and then they developed the core belief of I'm not safe, now their perceptions are attuned to evidence that I'm not safe. And because neurons that fire together wire together, they're more likely to have the freeze response activated again. Someone who freezes, who dissociates regularly, even in response to situations that are mildly threatening but don't need to be overwhelming, often finds that they're unable to extricate themselves from mildly threatening situations. And so a woman who suffered a sexual assault where her body couldn't escape, her freeze response was activated, and she dissociated because even if her body was stuck, it was a way for her mind to escape to some degree, later on might find her freeze response activated again, even when she's in a situation that she could get out of. And this is one of the reasons why people who have suffered abuse or sexual assault are more likely to be assaulted again. And these emotionally charged neural networks can be easily triggered by unrelated events. So that can mean there's now an even wider world of lower level threats that might activate the freeze response and turn those lower level threats into situations that can't be escaped. Now, let's talk about some of the clinical conditions that can develop after a traumatic event. Oftentimes we think only of PTSD when we think of trauma, but there are actually several different diagnoses for disorders that develop during or after stressful or traumatic circumstances. And these different diagnoses reflect varying levels of severity and how long the individual has had symptoms. First, we'll talk about acute stress disorder. In order for a mental health professional to make a diagnosis of acute stress disorder, symptoms have been present for at least 3 days after the event, and no more than 1 month after the event has concluded. In acute stress disorder, symptoms resolve within a month, with or without treatment. When symptoms last longer than a month, then we're generally getting into a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, which we'll discuss soon. During acute stress disorder, symptoms begin after an intensely stressful or traumatic event. This individual might experience distressing memories or dreams of the traumatic event. This person might be experiencing dissociative reactions or flashbacks in which it feels like the event were happening again. Now, there can be a spectrum of awareness with dissociative reactions. Some people will be aware that the event is not happening again, and others might lose awareness completely of the present and feel that they are actually back in the event. In acute stress disorder, an individual might have intense or prolonged physical reactions to memories or something that symbolizes or reminds them of the traumatic event. Also, someone who meets criteria for acute stress disorder might find themselves unable to experience positive feelings, such as happiness, satisfaction, or loving feelings. They might experience an altered sense of reality of themselves or their surroundings. This can look like seeing themselves from a different perspective as though they're outside of their body. That might look like time slowing. It might look like a feeling of unreality about the situation or that things are dreamlike. Someone with acute stress disorder might have difficulty remembering aspects of the event. And this would not be due to a head injury or intoxication, but rather to dissociative amnesia. Someone with acute stress disorder might be engaged in efforts to avoid thoughts or reminders of the event. They might have a hard time sleeping or concentrating. They might show irritability or angry outbursts toward others. And they're likely to be overly attuned to threats and be startled very easily. Now, someone who meets criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, they have had symptoms for at least a month and longer. These symptoms, once again, begin after an intensely stressful or traumatic event. This individual might have intrusive and distressing memories and dreams of the traumatic event. They might have dissociative reactions or flashbacks in which it feels like the event is happening again. They might have intense or prolonged physical reactions to memories or something that symbolizes the event. They might be engaged in efforts to avoid thoughts or reminders of the traumatic event. Someone who meets criteria for PTSD might also find themselves unable to remember certain aspects of the event. And again, that would not be due to intoxication or head injury, but rather due to dissociative amnesia. They might experience persistent, exaggerated negative beliefs about themselves or the world, such as, I'm bad, no one can be trusted, I'll never be safe. They might experience distorted thoughts about themselves or others being to blame for the event. They're likely to be experiencing persistent negative feeling states, such as fear, horror, guilt, shame, or anger. They might be experiencing a lack of interest or participation in normal life activities. They're likely to have difficulty relating or connecting to other people. And often they are also unable to experience positive emotions, such as happiness, love, and contentment. Oftentimes, individuals with PTSD will show a lot of irritable behavior or angry outbursts. They often have difficulty sleeping, and that can either mean getting to sleep or staying asleep. They often have difficulty concentrating. They are often overly attuned to threats and they startle easily. And they may show reckless or self-destructive behavior. Not everybody who experiences trauma develops a trauma disorder, however. And there are factors that make us more at risk for the development of these disorders, or that make us more resilient and less likely to develop something like acute stress disorder or PTSD. Risk factors include having a history of trauma or multiple traumas. And when we think about a history of trauma, we should even think back to our parents' trauma experiences. Studies in the field of epigenetics, which looks at how experiences change our genes, change our DNA, shows that when someone has had extremely stressful or traumatic circumstances, it can create changes in DNA that are passed along to children that haven't been born yet. This is important because mental health disorders always have some aspect of biological vulnerability. So if my parents have had extremely stressful experiences, those experiences might have created changes in their DNA, which made them more vulnerable to various mental health problems, and which make me, if I'm conceived and born after or during those stressful events, also more vulnerable to mental health problems. This is something to really keep in mind when we consider that health and mental health outcomes are worse for certain groups, such as racial minorities. When a family has experienced generations of stress due to racism and systemic injustice, or violence in their community, or poverty and lack of opportunity, it can create a greater vulnerability to trauma disorders and other types of mental health concerns. Someone is more at risk of developing a trauma disorder if the trauma was more severe, went on for longer, or if they were physically closer to the cause of the trauma. An example of this is research done on children in Japan after a devastating earthquake a few years ago. Children were more likely to develop trauma disorders when they were closer to the epicenter of the earthquake. Someone is more likely to develop a trauma disorder if they were physically injured, if they don't have good social support, and if they have additional stress following a trauma. Additionally, a person is more likely to develop a trauma disorder if they have a history of other mental illness or substance abuse. On the other hand, someone is less likely to develop a trauma disorder if they have good social support. Studies show that women who have been raped have better outcomes in the months and years after the rape if they have a significant other who can be supportive. Someone is less likely to develop a trauma disorder, additionally, if they can frame their own actions during a dangerous situation in a positive light. If they can see their actions as, I'm a survivor and a quick thinker, rather than, I'm a coward who hid while other people were hurt, that makes it less likely that they will develop a trauma disorder. Someone with good coping skills is less likely to develop a trauma disorder, as is someone who can act effectively in their lives after the trauma in spite of fear. And a higher level of education makes it less likely that a person will develop a trauma disorder, though that doesn't mean that people with high levels of education can't develop trauma disorders. Now we're going to spend some time talking about specific brain structures that are affected by trauma. A lot of the following information comes from the book Change Your Brain, Change Your Life by Daniel Amen, which is cited at the end of this presentation in the resources page. It's a great book to get more information on how different areas of the brain are involved in a variety of different types of problems, and it has suggestions for improving the functioning of these areas. Brain scans of people who have experienced trauma show increased activity in 3 areas: the basal ganglia, the limbic system, and the anterior cingulate gyrus. Increased activity in these areas is responsible for the thoughts and emotions and behaviors associated with trauma after the event is over. These ongoing effects are what cause trouble with functioning. Now we can take some steps to help these parts of the brain calm down or work more effectively, and we're going to talk about some steps that we can take. First, we're going to talk about the basal ganglia, which is that structure that you see there in the picture in the little square. Signs that the basal ganglia might be involved in some of the maladaptive thoughts, emotions, or behaviors following a traumatic event include the following: nervous or anxious feelings, restlessness, muscle tension and headaches, someone who's easily startled, has a tendency to freeze, being sensitive to criticism, fearing the judgment of others or avoiding conflict, poor confidence, being on guard for bad things to happen, tics or poor handwriting, fingernail biting or skin picking, and workaholism. Those symptoms might make sense if we consider what the basal ganglia does for us. The basal ganglia is involved in setting the body's anxiety baseline, or another way of thinking about that is that it acts like our anxiety thermostat. The basal ganglia is also associated with coordinating emotions with movement. Think about how when we're surprised or scared suddenly, our body jumps, our hands fly up. That's the work of the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia also smooths fine motor movement and suppresses unwanted movements. It's involved in motivation and drive. It's involved in pleasure, and it's involved in forming habits. There are some things that we can do to help the basal ganglia function at its best. First of all, we can use our breathing to help lower that baseline anxiety level. When we breathe, we can either breathe in such a way that our chest expands, the way most of us tend to breathe, or we can breathe so that our belly expands. When we make our belly expand, we're using our diaphragm, which is a muscle below the lungs, to pull air deep into the lungs. This is the way that babies breathe. Breathing this way sends calming signals to our brain and brings more oxygen into our bodies, which in turn tells our body that it doesn't have to work so hard to get air. Deep breathing is slower breathing, and both are good for helping us to feel more calm. To help the basal ganglia function at its best, we can begin practicing mindfulness or meditation. Mindfulness is a practice of alert awareness, being present in the moment, and taking a non-judgmental attitude to events that are occurring. For more information on mindfulness, you can take a look at the presentation on self-care. Mindfulness is simple and it doesn't take long, but consistent use can help the basal ganglia to function better. Going along with that, the practice of yoga, which also involves mindfulness, has been shown to be particularly effective at decreasing anxiety symptoms. One way to impact the basal ganglia for the better is to consider the role of nutrition. Reducing caffeine and alcohol can help the basal ganglia. Some people experience anxiety associated with a drop in blood sugar, and it can be a good idea to be tested for undiagnosed hypoglycemia. A diet low in carbohydrates, such as added sugar, bread, pasta, processed foods, and a diet that includes plenty of protein can help support good basal ganglia function. Another way to impact the basal ganglia for the better is to have a notebook where you can write down anxious thoughts and then write down a response to those thoughts. For example, my anxious thought might be, what if something happens to my spouse? And on top of missing him or her, I have to parent and provide for our family all alone. What if I can't do it? Then my response to that thought might be, I'm resourceful, and if it happened, I would take it one day at a time and find a way. I wouldn't have to figure out all the answers at once. Besides, I've done hard things before, and I've been okay. Next, a component of clinical anxiety is avoidance of things or events that trigger anxious feelings. Avoidance and anxiety becomes a cycle where anxious feelings lead to avoidance, which leads to more anxious feelings, which leads to more avoidance. To interrupt this cycle and teach the basal ganglia something new, you can be purposeful to not avoid anxiety-provoking situations that are safe. Make it a challenge to face situations that bring up anxious feelings, but which, thinking logically, are reasonably safe. Don't let the anxiety trap you into this anxiety and avoidance cycle. Going along with this idea to support the basal ganglia, work to develop healthy communication and conflict resolution in relationships. This is another way to stop avoiding anxiety-provoking situations. If needed, there are medications and supplements that reduce anxiety that can be prescribed or recommended by your primary care physician, some nurse practitioners, or a psychiatrist. Some people might need to take medications like this long term, but many people can take them to improve their functioning while they work with the psychotherapist to bring down their anxiety level in other ways. Some types of therapy are specifically geared toward anxiety. Acceptance and commitment therapy and EMDR are especially geared toward anxiety and trauma, and other therapies can be effective as well. Next, we'll look at the limbic system, which you can see in this picture here. The limbic system is composed of several smaller structures, and it includes the hypothalamus, which we discussed earlier as having a role in recognizing and communicating threats. The limbic system might be causing some trouble if someone is experiencing feelings of sadness, tearfulness, moodiness, low motivation, lack of interest in things that used to be enjoyed, a lack of interest in being around others, feelings of guilt, worthlessness, sensitivity to criticism, lowered libido, low energy, poor concentration, lowered sensitivity to smells, trouble sleeping, difficulty getting to sleep or difficulty staying asleep, or too much sleep, and also a lack of appetite or overeating. These are symptoms generally associated with depression. So let's think about what the limbic system is supposed to do for us. The functions of the limbic system include storing memories of highly charged emotional events, giving external events emotional meaning and importance. The limbic system sets emotional tone, which means setting a baseline emotional state. Do you generally feel pretty negative and irritable? Are you generally pretty cheerful and hopeful? That's emotional tone, and it affects how we interpret events. The limbic system is involved with motivation, appetite, and sleep. It directly processes your sense of smell, and it's involved with bonding and libido. When we think about the limbic system and bonding with others, the limbic system both affects and responds to the bonding that we have in our lives. So if our limbic system isn't working properly, it affects our ability to bond with others, maybe our interest in being around other people or our pleasure in their company. But the quality of our relationships, good or bad, sufficient or insufficient, also affects how well our limbic system works. There are some things that we or our clients can do to help the limbic system function better. It was mentioned that the limbic system directly processes smells. That's different than other senses, which have to travel to several different spots before they're processed in the brain. Smell is powerful, and one way that we can affect the limbic system for the better is with the use of aromatherapy. Lavender is associated with calm and relaxing, and peppermint and citrus are bright smells that can help us to feel more cheerful and alert. Acupuncture has shown to be effective in supporting improved limbic system function. Physical exercise, especially intense exercise, has been shown to increase the level of serotonin in the brain. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger, which is associated with improved mood and emotional regulation, and many antidepressants work by increasing the level of available serotonin in the brain. Nutrition can support improved limbic system activity. Specifically, reducing alcohol intake, which is a nervous system depressant, is a good idea. Also, chronic inflammation has been shown to be associated with depression, and an anti-inflammatory diet can reduce symptoms. For more information about nutrition's role in mental health and an anti-inflammatory diet, look for the self-care presentation. Generally, foods that cause inflammation are foods high in carbohydrates and heavily processed foods, while certain proteins, certain fruits and vegetables are especially good at reducing inflammation. To help the limbic system function better, make a practice of noticing automatic negative thoughts and talk back to them. An example of an automatic negative thought might be, "My friend hasn't responded to my text. She's probably mad at me." Talking back to this thought might look like saying to yourself, "Well, there are a lot of reasons she might not have responded. Sometimes I don't respond right away either, and she doesn't have any reason to be mad at me." Another example of an automatic negative thought might be, "My coworker is planning on applying for the same job I was excited to apply for. I would probably never get it if he's applying for it as well." Talking back to this thought might look like saying to yourself, "I might not get it, but I don't lose anything by applying, and it would at least be a good chance to get my name out there." Another way to affect the limbic system for the better is to keep a gratitude journal, and every day write down some things that you have to be grateful for. Every thought that we have produces chemical changes in our brains, so finding ways like this to focus on the positive can have a big impact. The limbic system is associated with bonding, and bonding causes improved limbic system functioning, so find ways to improve relationships. If needed, there are medications and supplements that can be prescribed to reduce symptoms of depression. And as mentioned before, often these medications can be taken temporarily while engaging in psychotherapy for more lasting changes. One type of therapy that can be particularly effective for the limbic system is family therapy, which aims to improve relationships within the family. Another type of therapy that specifically targets emotional functions related to relationships with others is emotionally focused therapy. Other types of therapies can be effective as well. Finally, we're going to look at the anterior cingulate gyrus, or ACG. That's the part in purple that you see there in the picture. Signs that something might be off with the ACG include excessive or repetitive worries or negative thoughts, feeling upset when things are out of place, feeling upset when things don't go your way, being argumentative or oppositional, having a frequent tendency to say no first, intense dislike of change, tendencies toward compulsive behaviors, difficulty seeing options and situations, difficulty shifting attention away from negative thoughts or feelings, unhealthy perfectionism, difficulty seeing different perspectives and changing your own opinion, and a tendency to hold grudges. Now, those are things that happen when the ACG isn't working quite properly because the functions of the ACG include cognitive flexibility, ability to shift attention from one thing to another, ability to go with the flow and to see options, adaptability, ability to see and turn from errors, and ability to cooperate with others. To help the ACG function at its best, you can take a nutritional approach. Complex carbohydrates, such as whole grains, can increase serotonin in the brain. Also, the nutrient L-tryptophan, which is found in turkey, green peas, salmon, eggs, and other places, helps to support good ACG function. Regular exercise also helps support ACG function. Mindfulness, as was mentioned before, can have a big impact, as well as the practice of thought stopping. In thought stopping, we learn to recognize repetitive, anxious thoughts that keep us trapped and deliberately shift our focus to something else. Thought stopping, like mindfulness, takes practice, and though both are simple, they often feel difficult at first. With time and practice, these become mental habits that can have a big impact. Another way to positively affect the ACG is when it feels like there aren't any options, to sit down and write down options and solutions. It can be effective to find ways to distract yourself from repetitive negative thoughts. If needed, there are medications and supplements that can help with anxious, obsessional, and intrusive thoughts and compulsions. Psychotherapy can also be effective. Solution-focused therapy can be a good way to increase available solutions and your ability to think flexibly. And EMDR can help with the negative core beliefs that might be at the foundation of inflexible and repetitive thoughts. Here is a list of references I used in the making of this presentation. Much of the information comes from my clinical practice, which I hope you've benefited from. We have covered understanding trauma and stress, the brain-body alarm system, the adaptive information processing model, and we've looked at both adaptive and frozen neural networks. We've talked about trauma disorders, acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. We've looked at risk and resilience factors for developing a trauma disorder. And we've looked at the role of brain structures, the basal ganglia, the limbic system, and the anterior cingulate gyrus. I hope this has helped to put stress and trauma reactions and behaviors into perspective and given you some good, effective steps to take to reduce the impact of stress and trauma for both you and the people you serve. Thank you for listening to this presentation.